Hello and welcome to the Periphery. Our guest today is a return guest, Dr. Alex Middlewood from Wichita State. She has written before for us here at Pulaski in our 50 Takes on Democracy series, talking about Kansas, where she's a resident, as you might have guessed from the Wichita State reference. And she's been on the podcast before as well. So we're happy to have her back here on the Periphery. She's the chair now of the Department of Political Science at Wichita State. And we're going to be digging into Kansas stuff and bigger American stuff in general. But welcome back to the Periphery, Alex.
Thanks for having me back. I'm always happy to be here.
Um, one of the first things I wanted to ask you about is this new venture you've got at Wichita State, IKE Lab, which is looking at tracking local elections. And I think that's just like a really cool. This is the kind of thing that we're very into at Pulaski in general, is like knowing what's happening in the many, many, many elections that happen across the state, right? Like county elections, school board elections, all kinds of things that people may not realize are being voted on. Talk a little bit about launching iClab and about the work you guys are doing, and maybe if you've got have already found some interesting stuff so far in Kansas.
Yeah, so IKE Lab grew out of an idea. My colleague Brian Amos, who's also here at Wichita State, and I were having some conversations about how during the amendment vote in 2022 in Kansas, we were getting so many media interviews from national media sources, and no one knew anything about what Kansas politics is actually like. And so it was a lot of explaining to these national reporters that, yes, Kansas is Republican, but it's not as conservative as it feels or seems like by looking at the state legislature. And we can see that by looking at some of these local races, also how Kansans tend to vote on issues like the abortion issue that was on that ballot, et cetera. And so we started having these conversations. We then wrote a academic journal article about who turned out to vote for that amendment, but specifically focusing on who then did not return to the ballot box in November. So who were those fall off voters who abortion was this really significant issue for them, got them to turn out in a primary election, but really didn't have a lot of interest in coming back out for the general. One of the things we found, for example, was that in Douglas County, which is where Lawrence is, home of the University of Kansas, the flagship institution here in the state, also sometimes known as the People's Republic of Lawrence, because it is so progressive and liberal compared to the rest of the state, we saw fewer voters in the general election in Douglas County than we saw in the primary, which never happens in an election. So we wrote this academic journal article and we started getting all of these questions about it. And we were like, there's just not enough information out there about Kansas elections. There are, a handful of political scientists who write op-ed columns every week. I am part of them. We're called Insight Kansas for local newspapers in Kansas. And we have great insight and we share that with Kansas readers, but there was just a lot of questions and a lot of information in Kansas that was not being utilized. My colleague Brian Amos is part of a another group called VEST, which is the I forget what the V stands for, but election science team basically. And so they run all of this data for several states and every state across the US, but no one really was digging into Kansas. And so we decided that we were going to apply for an internal grant from Wichita State University. And we were going to use it to launch the IKE Lab, where we are pulling new voter registration data every single month from the Kansas Secretary of State. And that data is not free, by the way, so we have to pay for it. But then we are cleaning up that data, putting it on the website so that anybody can access that and anyone can have that data. And we're doing, blog write-ups about it. We eventually want to grow the IKE Lab to look at things like content analysis of specific bills that are making their way through the legislature, how the language in those bills are maybe similar to previous bills that have been introduced or similar to previous bills that have been introduced in other states. And we really just want IKE Lab to be this hub for information about Kansas elections, which really doesn't currently exist. So we have great archival data on the Kansas legislature, on candidates. So Washburn University in particular has a really good archival set of this information for history, but nothing really contemporary exists out there. And so we decided that we were going to do it and we were going to make it publicly available for other people. And that this is something we're going to continue to update every month, and try to, write short little blog posts about this information that we're finding that maybe get some people's interest. So they want to then come and use this information. So we see this as being a hub for this information for, academics, for people who are doing public scholarship like the Pulaski Institution, for journalists, both in the state and, nationally. And we really just are committed to having and sharing this information, and this knowledge that no one is currently doing, at least in this specific capacity. And so we are excited to have officially gotten this off the ground, in the last couple of months, and are excited to see where we get to go in the future.
Uh, there's so much I want to dig into with that. I mean, I definitely want to get to some actual bills. We're going to talk about some bills in Kansas. Also, the People's Republic thing is this just like it's got to be like a Western college town thing. I feel like it's like I've heard People's Republic of Boulder, People's Republic of
Mhm.
Lawrence, People's Republic of obviously of Berkeley. I don't know. You never hear like People's Republic of Tuscaloosa. I don't know. College town, like I mean, our college towns are more liberal. They don't seem to translate maybe all the way into uh like bastions um of full blown socialism. But I'm sure it's pejorative for some people anyway. But for
Yeah,
most people, I don't
definitely.
know.
and
Um,
and Lawrence was alone in that, in their political beliefs in Kansas for a really long time.
mhm.
We're starting to see some shift in the Kansas City suburbs. But I think that plus the hate that they got thrown on them by, some more conservative members of the legislature kind of made them stand firm in that position of being the People's Republic of Lawrence.
Well, so this is something that I thought about when we were talking about this, even before the episode and while you were talking, which is, there's a ton of value, I think, on the upfront obvious end for researchers and analysts to like see what's going on in elections and see political opinion. But I also think there's something in these really deep red states that are red, right? Kansas is red,
Yes,
Arkansas is red. To have actual data that disputes the narrative that they are completely red, right? Because I something we dealt with here in Arkansas is right, like Sarah Huckabee Sanders and some statewide Republicans kind of acting as if there's just not anyone who disagrees with him in the state, and anyone who does disagree with him is representative of a not just a minority, but almost like a tiny, tiny, tiny fringe, maybe like 1% of the population. And that's not true, right? Like Arkansas is red, but it's like 30 something percent of the state. They're
right,
Democrats, and it's not that's not enough to win a statewide election. We're not gonna go blue. But at the same time, like those people do exist. But it fits
right,
a certain kind of political narrative to act like not just that you're in the majority, but actually that like those people are just like they don't even exist here. So anyone trying to tell you that there's a movement to oppose, a particular bill or a particular initiative is lying to you. I mean,
right.
did Kansas Republicans try to pull the same talking points?
Absolutely. Especially in 2022 when that amendment was on the ballot, to, if it was passed, it would allow the state legislature to regulate abortion, basically in counter to what the state Supreme Court had said. Um, and so Republicans in the state had this narrative, right, that Kansans are conservative, they are Republican, they are pro-life, and that they are going to fail this amendment, or excuse me, they're going to pass this amendment, which was also known as the Value Them Both Amendment.
Mm.
Um, and the message for the opposition, for the vote no side, was really this portrayal of constitutional freedom. And so, which also resonates with Kansans, which we weren't hearing really from the right side of the political spectrum in that time. And so, the big coalition that opposed the abortion amendment was called Kansans for Constitutional Freedom. We're seeing Missourians for Constitutional Freedom, for example, get off the ground there in Missouri because they're about to have, a similar constitutional amendment fight there.
We have one here in
Um,
Arkansas, and the group behind it is called Arkansans for Limited Government.
yeah,
Again, very much borrowing on more like kind of libertarian language.
right, exactly. And so, one thing that a lot of people forget about Kansas is it is a very populist state, not, right wing authoritarian populism that we see in more recent years, but Kansas has these deep roots in both right and left wing populism. And that has led to this really strong libertarian streak that still exists in Kansas today. And that was really underplayed leading up to that 2022 vote. And I spent so much time telling, reporters from the New York Times and BuzzFeed and all of these various national news sources that you're going to be surprised by the results in Kansas. I
Mm.
didn't think that it was going to be as large of a gap as it was. It was almost 20 points that amendment failed by, but I did expect that amendment to fail, especially once we saw this messaging around libertarianism, around constitutional freedom being used. And we know, for example, that about 30% of Republicans voted no on that amendment. So in Kansas, we have most voters are registered as Republicans. The second largest group of registered voters are independents, and then Democrats are the smallest group of those three. And we know that about 30% of Republicans had to have voted no to get the results that we got on that amendment. And it really goes to show that we live in this era of partisan politics, but when you let people vote on issues and policies themselves, they aren't necessarily going to vote with their party.
Mm.
And we have really seen that come to fruition in Kansas on the issue of abortion. We saw Republicans coming out to vote saying, maybe I personally don't support that type of medical care that people may need, but I don't think the government should be regulating that or banning that either. I kind of like the status quo, in other words. And so, and that's definitely what we saw with those results. And anytime you put something on the ballot in Kansas that has this kind of similar constitutional freedom, libertarian esque messaging behind it, I think we will see the same thing. One of the downsides is it's hard to put something on the ballot in Kansas. It has to go through the state legislature. We do not have initiative petitions. And so the legislature very clearly thought that this was going to pass because they chose to put it on the ballot, thinking that it was going to pass, and it didn't. And it failed by about 20 percentage points.
And I mean, one of the things we deal with here in Arkansas, you guys have actually elected, a Democrat to your congressional delegation, a Democrat to the governorship.
Yeah.
In Arkansas, with Governor Sanders, one of the things we've dealt with is just this kind of what I would argue is just mistaking partisan valence for personal support, right? So she
Yes.
ran, she got a pretty big amount of the vote for governor, but really, Arkansas was one, a low turnout state, but two, it is just a red state. So at the end of the day, when you're talking statewide elections, people are going to pull the lever for the R most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But since then, yeah, on some of these issues where actually the support within her own party doesn't actually break down uniformly for her, there's a kind of sense of, well, I won 60+% of the vote. That means 60+% of our Kansans at minimum are worth me on everything, right? And there's a kind of attitude about that. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's bad in red states, and that data like what you guys are trying to get, I think it's one thing to be able to. It's one thing just to assert, because there are people here who are like, we don't like some of these policies. It's another thing to be able to show like where the data and just say like there's not actually like no there isn't widespread support for this particular policy, or actually you can run a candidate that that is too much on a particular issue or
Yeah.
area. You know, getting into like this in terms of this the partisan valence of Kansas and the the whether or not it's in lockstep with wider Republican trends. So the Kansas House has a new bill planning to impose $100,000 fines on public colleges and universities uh, uh, based around DEI policy. So the
Yeah.
idea is to basically say we don't want DEI pledges in hiring. So essentially, if you've got uh, if you're having students or employees pledge to have DEI pledges or these kinds of agreements, we're threatening to fine public universities. You know, you just mentioned the People's Republic of Lawrence. That's the home of KU. Uh, how is this fight going down? I mean, we've seen it go down in Florida. We've seen it go down in a few other places. A lot of the attacks so far in a lot of states have been on the K-12 level. Florida is really the state that seems to have pioneered attacking higher ed on this stuff. But how is it going down in Kansas?
Yeah, so in Kansas, it does seem to be more of a kind of talking point used by Republicans in the state legislature. So, one thing to know about Kansas is that a vast majority of our seats in the state legislature are decided in primaries, okay, not in the general election. We are, we have pretty safe districts, both for Republicans and Democrats, obviously, a lot more of them being Republican. We have very few actually swing districts. And so, with those decisions being decided in the primaries, we know, political science research tells us that the people who turn out to vote in primary elections tend to be the party's base. They tend to be the diehards. And so we tend to often see more either progressive or more conservative members being elected in primaries than we would typically see in a general election. And definitely compared to the state voters as a whole. And so what tends to happen in Kansas is the more conservative members then get elected to the state legislature because those are the people who are turning out to vote in the primaries, are electing those people. And so we do have a fairly conservative Kansas House, especially compared to your average Republican voter in the state of Kansas. And so that's why we tend to see some of these bills coming up in the state legislature, like this DEI bill. This is also really just a good example of the nationalization of local and state elections that we have seen over the last several years all across the US. Um, and so, DEI and talking about DEI became hot button issues in other states. And then, Kansas House members see that and say, oh, well, I'm going to introduce this here in Kansas as well. We do, as you mentioned earlier, have a Democratic governor. What we tend to see with bills like this that are a little more on the kind of social war type of issues are they pass the legislature, they get vetoed by the governor, and then they don't have enough votes to override that veto, even though Republicans have a supermajority in both the House and the Senate in Topeka. And so that is what I would expect to see for this bill as well. Being introduced, probably passing the House, maybe passing the Senate, though it tends to be a little harder to get things through the Senate, but it will be vetoed by Laura Kelly, and I highly doubt it has enough votes to override that veto.
This is actually a really
Yeah.
interesting dynamic to me, different from some of the other states where this stuff is happening, where,
Mhm.
especially DeSantis now, who has pretty firm majorities in Florida, right, kind of gets to do what he wants, right? You got Christopher Rufo running the state's
Right.
premier liberal arts college, making sure that no one is talking too much about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, and I guess eliminating the scholarships for cat identifying students that apparently existed, and uh, um, but
Yes.
in those states, the concern has been, and then obviously in I think more the kind of traditionally understood deep red states like Alabama, that some of these moves have been understood to be um, really potential catalysts for brain drain. So I guess I'm curious, like in Kansas, if there's this sense of, wow, okay, it is a broadly conservative state. There are big Republican majorities in the legislature. But right now we've got a Democratic governor, and the kind of two-step here is that they pass something really conservative, and then the governor shoots it down. And then they kind of like coin toss chance that they actually override it. Does that affect people? Like, are people willing to kind of just put up with like, yeah, like every once in a while the legislature's just going to throw something crazy at the wall, and it's not really, I'm not really worried about it, or is there actual like anxiety among the type of people that working at universities, or just the sort of people that I guess maybe that we stereotype as like sort of uh future red state refugees in terms of, oh, now I got to get out, right? It's getting too nuts for me. Or does having this kind of bulwark in the governor's office mean that people aren't as worried about it?
Um, it definitely depends who you ask. Um, and I think for older people, and when I say that, I mean even like millennials and older. So if you're, 30 or older, um, a lot of people look at this and say, oh, Laura Kelly's in the governor's office. She's going to be okay. She's going to veto this. It's not really going to pass. I think younger people who are much more kind of plugged into issues like this and care about issues like this are much more disillusioned by it, and are very fearful. I know I hear almost every day from my students about how they're not comfortable living in Kansas. They don't feel safe here because of their own personal identities, and they really can't wait to get out. And that's unfortunate, especially for a state like Kansas that is constantly facing this brain drain and people are leaving. And this is something that, the state legislature does not deal with, but should be grappling with, if you ask me, is they're trying to get people to stay in the state, but then they're passing, these anti-DEI bills, these anti-trans bills, that are definitely making people not want to live here, and definitely not, raise children here. And then there's all sorts of other issues that kind of complicate that and make that even more difficult for people to want to stay here, like childcare is ridiculously expensive and there's a shortage of it in Kansas. And so you kind of have all of these things creating this environment that, socially and maybe even economically, Kansas is not the best place for some people to want to stay, and to put down roots and to stay here and, potentially raise families here. And so I think it really depends on who you ask, and also kind of how plugged into those complicated dynamics in Topeka that we actually have. Because, there are times where the state legislature does override Laura Kelly's veto on things, and there are times that they don't. And it can be a little hard to predict that, and what is going to be able to be overridden and what isn't. And so I think it's something that as a state, Kansas really needs to decide, what their goal is here. Do they want young people to stay in the state and to, be this, economic, to bring with that, economic prosperity, et cetera, or do they want to continue to talk about these culture war issues, and drive, especially young people, out of the state, when they already kind of want to do that? And so, um, it's difficult, and it really depends on, how close people are to the issue. Um, I know that there are people, that I have known personally who have not wanted to stay here for those specific reasons, or who have taken jobs elsewhere because they don't want to raise their children in a state where they're not going to be safe if they are LGBTQ plus, or if they are, racially diverse or whatever it may be. But I think that that's another thing too that I also think the Kansas legislature doesn't really consider is when we talk about DEI, we're not only talking about race, we're talking about diversity in all different aspects. So if you, for example, write a diversity statement for a job that you're applying for at an institution of higher ed, let's say Wichita State, for example, you don't have to talk about race. You can talk about, gender. You don't have to talk about sexuality. You can talk about things like, being a Pell Grant recipient when you went to college, being a first generation college student, coming from a lower socioeconomic background. All of those things are also considered DEI, because that is not the norm for faculty, especially faculty at universities. And so I think when we think of DEI, when the state legislature is thinking of DEI, they're specifically thinking about, sexual orientation and race, and a lot of these culture war issues, but it's so much more than just that. And all of these types of diversity are important at institutions of higher ed. I can only speak to Wichita State specifically because that's where I'm at. But we have a goal, for example, of being a Hispanic serving institution within the next 5 years. And we are on track to meet that goal. But we also have very few faculty members who are Latina or Hispanic. And so it would be to our benefit to hire more faculty who have that background for our students. But something like this wouldn't give us the ability to do that. Or we also have a really high number of underserved students at Wichita State, which is not just, race, but is also they are Pell Grant eligible. They're a first generation college student. And there are very few faculty members who meet that similar type of background.
Well,
And so
what's the on-campus environment then? Like, I guess is there fear? I mean, maybe you can't talk about it, but is there fear at Wichita State about this stuff, about these fines? I mean, I don't assume, that's the other thing is public universities are not all cut from the same cloth, right?
correct.
KU can probably shell out a fine, and like kind of handle it, right? But I don't assume every public university can roll with
Yeah.
these penalties.
Yeah, it definitely is a case by case basis for institutions. And it also comes down to, how much do you want to upset the state legislature when they're giving you your budget every year? And which universities are willing to do that? And so there are lots of different pieces at play here if this were to pass.
This is something I thought about when we were kind of talking about, I was thinking about when we mentioned Lawrence, but then also when we were talking about like brain drain and stuff. What is because you guys share this, you're unique in that there aren't too many states where the biggest metro straddles the state line.
Mhm.
And yet also the state that you guys share Kansas City with is Missouri, and Missouri is, I think at this point, arguably more right wing, at least in terms of the people they're putting in power. Maybe its electorate is not as right wing, but the people being elected are certainly, uh, you had Eric Greitens as a statewide candidate, just a full
Right.
on maniac, right? And so you look at a state like that. I'm curious, like, are there Missourians who are looking at Kansas City and thinking like, well, this is better. This is a city that's like kind of home, kind of not, but it's better that, I'd rather live on the Kansas side than the Missouri side. Or are there, does Kansas City hold off any of that brain drain effect in some ways or not?
So I don't know the specific data on this, but kind of anecdotally, if you look at the suburbs of Kansas City, those on the Missouri side tend to be less economically well off compared to those on the Kansas side.
Hmm.
And so my guess is just based on that would be that a lot of people who, come to Kansas City or already live there, they work in Kansas City or on either side of the state line, especially now are choosing to live on the Kansas side. The cities tend to be a little bit more liberal and progressive than on the Missouri side. The state government is a little more moderate than on the Missouri side, but the schools are better economically, those suburbs are doing better. I have friends who live on the Missouri side because they have their entire lives and they refuse to leave. But I also know that a lot of people are moving into those Kansas suburbs of Kansas City specifically. And they do have a lot better school districts. And that tends to be a reason why people are making that move. So I don't know the specific data, but just based on that and what I do know, I would say there does seem to be some movement from Missouri into the Kansas suburbs instead.
I think that's like a good pivot point to take you to non-Kansas news. But when you wrote your 50 takes piece for us, you focused on local control on home rule in Kansas.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that's really interesting to me, I'm a Southerner, and the South and the West have a long history, right, of talking about conservatives in these places, long history of talking about states' rights. Um, but as someone from a more like liberal, not left wing liberal, like liberal philosophical tradition, I think a lot about decentralization actually has a lot of merit to it. But in terms of giving people more political power closer to where they live, there's a lot of good arguments for that. But what's interesting to me, we're seeing in a lot of red states now is this push that says, well, yeah, we want power. Um, we want power relative to Washington. We're not really interested in our counties or cities having power relative to us because then we can't do what we want. And one of the things we've seen in Florida is this new measure, right, in the Florida legislature that would strip local authorities of their ability to set, heat safety regulations and restrictions for employees.
Mhm.
And it's basically, the state stepping in and setting its own labor standards. Obviously, that might seem like a niche issue. In a state like Florida, right, like heat protections for workers is a big deal. It's a hot state. It's a humid state. It's only going to get more hot and humid. So this is something relating kind of back to your piece for 50 takes, but also just generally this phenomenon, right, of red state governments, legislatures, and governors taking power away from local authorities to set standards and make regulations, which I think is a really interesting contradiction to the kind of way they talk about, right, government, at least when it comes to Washington, in the press.
Yeah. So we often have this misconception, and this is pushed by the parties themselves, that the Republican Party is the party of small government, the Democratic Party is the party of big government, and that is a way oversimplification of this topic. So both Democrats and Republicans like small government and like big government when it serves their own policy interests. And that's exactly what we're seeing here in Florida is, the Republican Party, which is the party of small government, it doesn't want local governments to be able to make these decisions about, protecting their workers from heat issues. So they're stepping in and saying, no, you're not allowed to do this, which is totally opposite of what you would expect from the party of small government. And that is because both parties pick and choose small, big government when it suits their own interests and their own needs and when they want to, pass certain policies. So in this case, right, the Republican Party has taken a pretty firm stance, um, maybe not against global climate change, but certainly not pro preventing global climate change. And so it makes sense that because of that policy stance, that they would then try to not let these local units of government try to pass policies that would allow them to deal with the heat indexes on their own, because it serves that broader interest here. And so there are all sorts of drawbacks to that, of course, but it really varies state by state. So to be honest, I don't know if Florida has a home rule clause in their constitution. I can tell you that Kansas does, which can change the dynamic. But it really then just goes to the courts, and the courts get to decide who is right in here. Can the state government impose that on local governments, or do local governments have their home rule right to be able to make these policy decisions? But it really is just this, part of a broader national policy issue for the parties that is playing out at this very local level when it comes to heat.
Mm.
Um,
Well, and this is
and
like relates, I think, back to the brain drain conversation we were happening because there's the question of like right or wrong or political preference, right? But then there's also, in some cases, there's municipalities. One of the things I think, kind of the first story that really struck me in this current age about this stuff was when North Carolina had all the bathroom bill stuff, and Charlotte said, "Well, we're not going to do that. We're going to allow, uh, you know." unisex bathrooms, and we're going to be fine with people who identify, like if you identify as male, you can use the men's bathroom, etc. uh, and there's the political valence to that of like ensuring, saying, we actually want to make sure for the people who live in our town that they have these rights and that they're not infringed upon. But I mean, frankly, look, Charlotte is, right, like one of the big finance centers of the United States. It's the big hub in the Southeast for American finance, right? Like Charlotte has a reason to not want to be a place where, people who are from San Francisco and New York and Boston, or frankly London or Paris, whose companies want to relocate them to Charlotte for one reason or another, to say, no, I'm not moving there because of, I have a gay or trans child and they won't be treated right. Like you don't want that. Like
right,
Charlotte has these actual, there's the political side of it, which I think is fully meritorious. But then there's also just the general sort of, we were talking about brain drain, right? Element of, well, these cities like aren't interested in losing dynamism just because their state legislatures want to pass something kooky.
right. Absolutely. And it makes it difficult for cities and companies in those cities to try to attract people to who want to move there when the state legislatures are doing this. And we have, several examples across states, including in Arkansas, of big
Mm.
companies stepping in and saying, calling the governor and saying, you're going to veto this because we are the huge economic driver in this state and we don't support this. And then governors do often veto it, or, state legislatures kill it on the floor or whatever it may be. And there is this huge economic component to this as well. And we definitely need to be considering that. So to take the Florida example of heat and kind of move it to Kansas with something I
Mm.
know a little bit better. Southwest Kansas in particular has huge meat packing plants. Lots of people kind of learned that during COVID. And the heat that we're seeing here in Kansas really affects those workers. And so if, for example, the state legislature tried to tell, Dodge City and Garden City here in Kansas that they can't do anything to regulate that, that's going to be a problem for those huge meatpacking plants. Um, and they're not going to just sit back and let the state government make that decision. They're going to say, no, we want people to come here and work, and we have to make sure that they do want to come and work in these factories because it's so hot. We have a similar thing here in Wichita with the airline industries, um, etc. And so there is this huge economic impact of political decisions like this that seem to be being made for these kind of larger social cultural commitments to a national party platform, but have these real economic impacts on the local level and on specific industries too.
When it comes to these DEI and CRT type cultural war bills, are there elements, are there mechanisms within home rule that allow places to actually push back on these at all, or is it really not strong enough to give them anything?
Yeah, so I mean, there's always the ability for them to go through the court system to, kind of decide if a DEI bill like this would be constitutional. Um, but then there's also kind of ways to apply or implement bills that maybe aren't compatible with the spirit in which they were written, but are more compatible with the political and social and economic reality of the state. So bills are passed, in the state legislature, but it's really up to the executive branch to implement those bills.
Mm.
And so we have, bureaucracies. We use, the term bureaucracy negatively in the United States, but bureaucrats are just people who work for the government and implement policy. Um, and so when something like this is passed by the legislature, it's then the bureaucracy and the executive branch that actually get to implement that and decide how that's going to be implemented. We see this, same at the national level, where decisions that are being made by Congress have been implemented in a very different way by the executive, and that can change based on, who's the president or who the governor is.
And
And
I
so
guess
you
we
could
should
potentially,
clarify for people, you've written about it extensively, but the home rule idea is enshrined in Kansas Constitution, accords these
yes,
local Kansas um, governing bodies, right, with a certain kind of power relative to the state that isn't written into a lot of
correct,
state constitutions.
correct. Yes, that is accurate. Um, and so states that don't have that home rule can, turn to the executive branch to see how this is going to be implemented. And that can create even more partisan tensions, especially if the governor and the legislature are from different parties. Um, and so you could, for example, see, a DEI bill like this being passed in the Kansas legislature and then being implemented very differently by the executive branch and by the governor. Um, and so, maybe the way that that is implemented is it's not using, DEI specific language, but you can still ask people pretty much the same thing, just using different language. And so there's different ways to implement these laws to kind of get around the spirit that they were written in, but that are, much more practical for the actual application of those laws.
I love talking about home rule. I think it's one of those, like, Pulaski, we talk about place-based democracy all the time, right? And I just think it's one of those uh really cool features that I kind of think every state should have it. I mean, I think it's pretty incredible. I'm sure you're biased that way too as a Kansan now. Um,
A little bit, yeah. I mean, in some ways, right, it can be used positively, like some of those ones, we just mentioned, or that I wrote about in my Pulaski piece. But in some ways, it can also be used negatively to kind of circumvent decisions that are made by the people. So to go back to, the abortion amendment example in Kansas, where the Kansas Constitution, has been interpreted to protect the right to that medical care. But there are cities and counties that have tried to say, well, we have home rule, and therefore we are going to pass these different policies that say you can't, help someone leave the county to access abortion care. Or some other states have done this too, where you can't, drive through that county to access abortion care, et cetera. And so they're using home rule in kind of that way, which
mm.
completely goes against what the Kansas voters just said and decided about a year and a half ago. And so it gets a little complicated when it's kind of just blanket home rule.
I bet. Well, so I think that this is a good place to, we have our chatter, and you've given us before a little chatter question. So I always hit you with, I guess, something maybe a little different. If it's something maybe more seasonal, which is, if winter's coming to an end. I know winter in Kansas can be pretty rough. Uh,
It's so windy.
and
It's brutal.
if when winter's coming to an end, is there a place in Kansas that's like a good uh you know down here we've got a few places that are maintained. There's a really cool, the University of Arkansas maintains this kind of landscaped gardens and hot springs that my wife and I like to go to
Mhm.
when like mid-spring hits. Is there a sort of thank goodness winter is over kind of place in Kansas you like to hit up?
Yeah, so about an hour and 20 minutes ish northeast of Wichita, there is the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve. So it's run by the National Park Service. And it used to be a ranch. And so it's really difficult in Kansas to find land that has been unaltered by agriculture. So it was a ranch where they raised farm or cattle, and it has resulted in one of the last places that you can get it can witness natural tall grass prairie in the Great Plains. And so it is now a preserve. The family donated it to the National Park Service. Several years ago, they reintroduced a buffalo herd. And you can now go do either a bus tour of the preserve or you can go hike through it. And you can see all the buffalo wallows and you can see, the grass starting to sprout in the spring. And it's a really lovely location to just, go take a walk, take a picnic. If you're a hiker, do a little bit of a longer hike. But I love Tallgrass Prairie, and I think it's one of the best kept secrets in Kansas to just go up there and get outside for the day in the spring. It's really great.
All right. That's rad. I love stuff like that. I especially love finding out there's like, like sort of secrets of the lands that the federal government actually manages, because there's so much of it that people don't always realize are there. So that's very cool.
Yeah, there absolutely is.
Well, Dr. Alex Middlewood of Wichita State, new project is the IKE Lab. Really excited to get to talk to you again. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you everyone for listening or joining in the video feed. And we will see you guys again next week with Bailey Fairbanks.